Greetings. My name is Allison Dennis. I serve as Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's winter keynote. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north central Oregon coast and resides on the unceded traditional lands of the Indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. There is much to learn as one step the Sitka community can take. I really encourage all of us to make a visit or four to the Grand Ronde Chichala Museum and Cultural Center this year, which is featuring a four-part year-long series of exhibits entitled Stick, which explores our relationship with the forest over time. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Cristina Eisenberg. Climate change, land use shifts related to Euro-American settlement, and the related elimination of Indigenous cultural stewardship practices are increasing the size and severity of wildfires throughout North America. Tonight, Dr. Eisenberg will discuss how returning Indigenous stewardship to Pacific Northwest forests, including cultural burning, can increase these forests' climate resiliency. Dr. Eisenberg is the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence and Director of Tribal Initiatives at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry and Professor of Practice. In the College of Forestry, she directs the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Lab and the Indigenous Natural Resource Office. As a Native American and Latinx ecologist, she leads several long-term ecological restoration projects, including the BLM OSU Fort Belknap Grassland Restoration Project in Montana, and the Pacific Northwest Tribal Conservation Corps pilot project for Seeds of Success, which involves working with 5 of the tribal nations in Oregon. We have a large audience tonight, so please, wherever you are in the Sitka community, make enough noise so that it rises up through the canopy above the tree line and help us all welcome Cristina Eisenberg to the Sitka Center.
Thank you for that, Allison, and it is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I should add that one of the foundations that supports Sitka has endowed the position that I have as the Director of Tribal Initiatives. It's Maybelle Clark McDonald Foundation, and that happened a few months ago, and it's such a huge contribution and makes such a strong statement about the importance of supporting healing for tribal nations and respect for our traditional knowledge. So today I'm going to talk about a 7th generation approach to restoring climate resilience to our forests in the Pacific Northwest. Really what I'm going to talk about pertains to forests throughout North America, but I'm going to focus more specifically on this region. So this is what we're dealing with in the Pacific Northwest. This is a photograph I took in Oregon. All of the brown trees, these are all Doug firs, and they're dying from drought stress. And they're standing dead trees. And there's extensive stands like this throughout the Pacific Northwest. And this is climate change in action. And these forests, how they're growing today, are not adapted. They don't have the resilience to deal with severe drought. And so in my talk, I'm going to share what are some of the changes that occurred that led to this and how we can restore resilience to these forests. And by the way, this is in one of my study sites in Oregon. So I'm going to give you some background on how we got to where we are today. This is a very famous painting. It's called American Progress. That is actually the Oregon Trail, and that is the Columbia River, and that's Lewis and Clark traveled that trail before the settlers did. And Lewis and Clark, most of us learned in school that they were amazing naturalists. Like in high school, they teach you about, their journey and all, it was about learning about all the plants, the flora and the fauna, the wildlife, and exploring this land with fresh eyes. Really, the purpose of their journey was to claim ownership of the Columbia River by planting a flag at the mouth of it. And the way federal laws are written in the US and Canada, whoever claimed the mouth of a river then owned the entire watershed of that river. Now, think about how vast the watershed of the Columbia was. At the time, the US had owned everything up to the Mississippi. So yes, they did all this ecology work, but it was really about settler colonialism. And that's defined as the policy of a foreign polity seeking to extend or retain its authority over other peoples and their territories to develop or exploit them. This is the formal policy legal definition, to exploit them to benefit the colonizing country and help the colonies modernize in terms defined by the colonizers. This is what happened everywhere on the planet, most places. I used to be the chief scientist at Earthwatch Institute, and I had oversight over 50 projects on 6 continents. And everywhere I went, I would join the scientists that we funded. Many of them were indigenous in places like Mongolia and Kenya, the Amazon headwaters. It was the same story. So this isn't just what happened in what is today the United States. This happened all over the world. And the impacts were similar. So these are the impacts of settler colonialism. And the dams, such as the Klamath dams, the clear cutting, fire exclusion, and unbridled draining of wetlands and killing all the bison and large predators. Here's another consequence of settler colonialism. Throughout the United States, the land that was taken, stolen from indigenous peoples, was used to establish 58 land grant institutions. OSU, Oregon State University, received 92,000 acres of indigenous lands. And it is located on formerly the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Mpinafu Band of Kalapuya people. And these communities were forcibly moved to reservations in Western Oregon, and they continued to live on reservations, many of them. So we are taking Oregon State University beyond the land acknowledgement. My position was created in February of 2022, and I started work in September of last year. It's the first ever position like this in Oregon and then throughout the United States. When I was hired, I believe it was the only one of its kind, in that I'm an associate dean, which gives me a certain ability to create change. And that's actually in my position description. I'm supposed to create change and take our college beyond the land acknowledgement. So I work on DEI, tribal initiatives, indigenous knowledge, tribal co-stewardship. This is in alignment with the new College of Forestry strategic plan. And as I explained earlier, the work that I do is funded in part by an endowment from the Maybelle Clark McDonald Foundation. So the Indigenous Natural Resource Office is a safe, decolonized cultural space for Indigenous students. It's a place to develop relationships across cultures. We have the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Lab, which is for grad students, 2 postdocs, and a graduate research assistant, and an admin assistant, and a program manager. The 7th generation philosophy is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, which is defined as knowledge and practices that are passed across generations, across millennia, and they're spiritual and cultural, and they include sensitivity to change. So the traditional Indigenous perspective is that the world is always changing. And if we pay attention, we just might learn what we need to survive and live rightly. It's based on reciprocity and also cultural humility, knowing that humans are probably the dumbest creature on the planet. sedges are smarter than we are. And so if we pay attention with humility, if we truly listen, nature holds a lot of wisdom. It's a very different view of the world than the Western settler colonial view of the world. So this image depicts the Indigenous view of the world. There's 2 books, Braiding Sweetgrass and Native Science, that I highly recommend to learn more about these perspectives. 7th generation philosophy is based on the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois principle that decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 human generations into the future. You can contrast this with the sustained yield concept, which was advanced by Gifford Pinchot around the turn of the last century, early 1900s. It was considered highly progressive at the time because before then, people were just like wantonly cutting forests without any thought to the future. And however, this perspective is based on capitalism. So a famous quote of his is that there are just 2 things on this material earth, people and natural resources. These 2 different worldviews. So there's the egocentric, which is the Pinchotian perspective on sustained yield aligns with that. That's man over nature. And also the conservation perspective. It's like we can control nature, so we should take whatever we want, or we should protect as much as we can and keep people out of it. It's very different from the native perspective, which is ecocentric, which is humans are embedded in nature. We are intrinsic to nature, and it is our moral obligation to take care of nature by the same way we would take care of our family, basically. If you bring together Indigenous knowledge with Western science, what you get is something called 2-eyed seeing. So it's a way of building these relationships, and this is what we do in the Indigenous Natural Resource Office, is build these partnerships, help foster them across cultures, because Indigenous knowledge is the original wisdom, it's science, and Western science is this incredible technology. And when you bring them together, you get this binocular vision that enables you to adapt to global change and find ways to increase resilience to things like climate change. Robin Wall Kimmerer uses sweetgrass as a metaphor for this. It is a sacred grass. It grows in Oregon, although it's not very abundant in Oregon because of natural resource management actions that have affected populations of sweetgrass. It represents the intertwining of science and Indigenous knowledge. And so a braid of sweetgrass, it's really hard to braid sweetgrass, by the way. This is my field crew learning how to braid sweetgrass a couple years ago. So, and this is an all Indigenous field crew. And even for Indigenous people, it's not a simple thing to do. And what you have is 3 strands. One strand represents Indigenous knowledge. The other strand represents Western science. And the middle strand, that represents what brings us together, that spirit, that is our deep, deep concern about what's happening to forests in the Pacific Northwest, for example, or species extinctions, extinction of wildlife, the vast scale and pace of global change that are threatening lifeways that have existed for millennia. So that's spirit that brings us together across cultures. So when you hear me talk about let's braid some sweetgrass together, that means let's figure this out together. So Indigenous people used stewardship practices such as cultural burning. That globally, that's one of the most common tools that Indigenous peoples used. The image on the right is from one of my study sites. It's on the prairie in Alberta. And those are Blackfoot burning the prairie, which greatly increased the health of that grassland and called in the bison because those prairie grasses, these burns are very low severity, they're very light. And what these plants are all adapted to being burned. They love being burned seasonally and with these light fires. And what that it does is it keeps the understory more open and the canopy more open. In a grassland, those native grasses start sprouting within 24 hours after a cultural burn. It's astonishing. And everything is more vigorous. So it increases the pace of the nitrogen cycle. So nutrients cycle more rapidly and vigorously through forest and grassland ecosystems. Dr. Frank Lake, who is an alumnus of Oregon State University, is a leader. He works for the Forest Service, and he has been implementing many cultural burns. And also UC Davis professor Beth Rose Middleton Manning. These are some examples. So Indigenous knowledge is about the ecology of caring. In 2021, the White House issued a memorandum calling that every federal agency recognize Indigenous knowledge as one of the most important bodies of knowledge that contributes to scientific, technical, and economic advancement in the US. Now, you'll see it referred to as TEK, Indigenous Knowledge, IK, or ITEK. What happened is there's been a progression in this term, and the White House convened some meetings about a year ago to ask Native people, what do you prefer that it be called? And there were about 500 Indigenous leaders present at those meetings. I was part of one of them. And the consensus was that it's Indigenous knowledge. So now the federal government refers to it as that consistently. And that's the term that is really preferred. Secretary Haaland stated, we don't want to continue hurting Mother Earth. This was in a meeting that I attended that she led, the White House meeting. We don't want to continue hurting Mother Earth. We are protecting her so that she is not damaged any more than she already is. We're striving to get it right and find the best path forward. The federal colonialist system doesn't work. The ecology of caring is a term created by environmental philosopher and nature writer Kathleen Dean Moore, who some of you may know of. She's from the Pacific Northwest. And I recommend her book, The Pine Island Paradox, on this topic. So what are we going to do about this? This is another picture I took in one of my study sites about 3 weeks ago. These trees are dying. They're Douglas firs. This is in formerly a late successional reserve, an LSR, protected by the Northwest Forest Plan. These reserves have not been touched since the early 90s. These trees are like toothpicks. So you see all the dead branches. The way you can assess the health of a tree, a conifer, is that the green growing branches should extend through the most of its trunk, most of its length of its trunk. And if it's less than 2/3 of the trunk of the tree has green branches growing, then that tree is dying. It's in decline. As you can see here, it's not even 1/3 of the length of the trunks of those trees that have green growing branches. So what happens if this gets struck by lightning? This is like an instant fire. And that is what Frank Lake, his major epiphany was that with the Megram fire in California in 1999. And it was a mega fire. And he realized then that, maybe we're not doing this right. And he's Karuk. There was a comment in the chat. Yes, the Douglas firs do shed their lower branches, but the amount of the trunk that's covered by growth is the majority of the trunk. So what you're seeing in that image is abnormal. Here's what happened. I'm sure many of you remember the Labor Day fires. There was a windstorm, power lines came down, and within 3 days, 7 megafires erupted. And they burned old growth stands. They burned stands like the ones I showed you pictures of, where the fuel loading, those are called ladder fuels, when the trees are all packed together and there's these dead branches of, a little spark will cause the whole thing to go up in flames. So the Labor Day fires were a major wake-up call for everybody else. I'm on the state of Oregon fire response leadership team to represent Indigenous perspectives. And that team was convened by the governor in response to the Labor Day fires. And now that it's a few years have gone by, it's more, how can we be as proactive as possible? And what are some of the management shifts we may need to make? So here's some examples of some of what's happening. I was one of the co-authors of the Society for Ecological Restoration, International Principles and Practices for Ecological Restoration. This is a document that was peer-reviewed and is used by the United Nations for restoration globally. I helped write the second principle, which is to be effective ecological restoration needs to draw on all types of knowledge, including local place-based knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And some definitions are helpful here. So ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Ecocultural restoration is the process of restoring key historic pre-contact, pre-industrial ecosystem structures, processes, and functions, and the indigenous cultural practices that help shape ecosystems. These images are from the Flathead Indian Reservation, and that's the easternmost edge of the Pacific Northwest biome. And this is a camas restoration project that they are doing and have been doing for years in partnership with the Forest Service. And what they did was the forest there resembled the ones I showed you in that image, dense and dying. They thinned the forest very carefully and respectfully and lightly. Then they burned the forest with a low severity cultural burn. And immediately all of these camas came up. Camas is a culturally significant plant in that it is one of the most important food sources of plant food for many tribes. So there was this cultural memory in the soil. There was this, seeds in the soil that all germinated after this cultural burn. And so that whole area is thriving with wildlife. The trees are happy, the plants are happy. And this is an example of what happens when one restores processes, functions, and practices to systems that have become degraded. To have healthy ecosystems, we need to braid together multiple ways of knowing. But this will only work if everyone has a voice and nobody is tokenized or exploited. So we all need to sit in a circle together and listen to each other with respect. That's not always so easy to do, but that's what we strive for. And this braid of sweetgrass represents that. So at Oregon State, in the College of Forestry, at Oregon State, there were no principles and practices for partnering with tribal nations, nothing official. And so one of the first things I was tasked with is to create them. Only I said to my supervisor, the dean of the College of Forestry, well, I can't do that on my own. I need to build community around this. So I created a task force, and the task force was composed of a really diverse group of people from the college, students, professors, people from a variety of cultures and backgrounds. It was this incredible process. It took us 4 months to create these principles, and they were shared with the whole college, and everybody got to give us guidance and weigh in. And by June of last year, we finalized them, and there was wholehearted support for them by people in the College of Forestry community and at the university. And then the White House asked for these, and they're using them to inform some federal policies. I'll go over these really quickly. You start by acknowledging settler colonialism. So you have to say, this is what happened. How do we heal this damage? Not doing that is like putting a Band-Aid over a wound that's infected without treating it. It's not going to create the kind of healing that you want. The second point, early and sustained engagement. You want to communicate with tribal nations the minute you have an idea that you want to try to do something. So you don't wait until, if you're a Western scientist who is non-Indigenous, you don't wait until you have a research proposal, you've submitted it for funding, you've gotten your funding, then you go to the tribe and say, hey, I got this grant, let's work together. Instead, when it's just this glimmer of an idea, you have a meeting with them, and you meet with them in a very decolonized manner, generally around food, and say, what are your priorities? Here are some of our thoughts. What do you think? And so then you co-create. It's that two-eyed seeing model. You need to be transparent and open about ideas and agendas at all times. And that is not the way people typically do things in the scientific world. We're taught to protect our ideas, guard them. That's opposite of how things work in the Native world. Also respect that processes and worldviews can be different. So Indian time is a real thing. And in the Indian world, in the Native world, we do things in a nonlinear manner, and children are listened to, and elders are listened to as part of decision-making in a community. And when there are challenges, and there will be challenges, to adapt to them with cultural humility. It's nobody's fault, but if we all are open and humble about things and say, this isn't quite working, let's figure this out together, that's where you build stronger relationships. Consider supporting co-stewardship and co-management partnerships. And tribes in Oregon some of them are pretty involved in these types of partnerships, co-stewardship. I'm not going to get into formally what they mean. That would be a whole other talk, but they are formal partnerships. They're government to government partnerships. Consider co-production of knowledge. That means if you're going to publish journal articles, reports, write books, ask the tribes that you're working with if they want to be co-authors. Invite and welcome their participation, and that will only strengthen the work. Provide ample funding to tribal nations at each step of the partnership. So if you are looking to have your work as a Western scientist, and this applies to artists as well, by the way, and I am an artist. My bachelor's degree is in fine arts and painting. So if you're going to work with a tribal nation in whatever way, to make sure that that reciprocity piece, that if you're benefiting from information they're sharing with you, that you're directly benefiting their community as well by supporting them in some manner. And then share power and decision-making authority with tribal partners. And there's a link to those principles and best practices. So here's an example. This is a 5-year project that Allison mentioned in the introduction. It's a 3-year ethnobotany, $5 million project that involves seed collection, working with tribal nations in Western Oregon. It's to restore climate resiliency to forests. It's to look at the role of the understory traditional plants, culturally significant plants, in building resilience in these forests. Many of those plants are nitrogen fixing. They have a variety of benefits to forest systems, and forests have been managed historically throughout the United States as more monocultures and then protected, but these plant communities haven't quite come back. And some of it is because of lack of cultural burning, with which many of these plants have co-evolved. So we are collecting plant material for restoration. We're creating many, many, many job and education opportunities for tribal youth, including funding graduate students in the TEK lab, many field technician positions, many paid internships. We're co-creating an ecocultural restoration plan, and we're honoring tribal sovereignty at every step. This image on the right is That's Tom DeLuca, the Dean of the College of Forestry. He's a co-investigator in this project. He's teaching the Kuspe, the Siti Klusi tribes, their tribal interns, how to dig a soil pit. And looking at all the signs, this is a cedar forest of a former cedar forest that was clear cut and then replanted with Douglas fir, but you can still see the old cedar stumps. And looking at all of the layers of charcoal in the soil from prescribed burning, from cultural burning historically. So this is a moist forest that, according to Western science, burned very rarely, and we found so much evidence of cultural burning, frequent cultural burning in that forest. And it's a very diverse research team. Lou Whitebear, who some of you may have heard of, she was one of the co-founders of the ENA House, the Longhouse at Oregon State University, is a co-PI. A variety of fire ecologists, restoration ecologists. It's an amazing team. And it's funded by the Department of Interior. This is my story slide. Well, they're all story slides. I'm the lead author of a report. Susan Pritchard is my co-lead author that we're writing for the federal government, for the White House, on Braiding Sweetgrass is the title, Increasing Climate Resilience of U.S. Forests. So the report is the braid of sweetgrass. We are bringing together Indigenous knowledge and Western science. It's an Indigenous-led decolonized report. This is what the federal government wanted. There's 30 co-authors, a third of us are Indigenous. It describes very clearly tribal forestry perspectives. It rethinks the idea of forest reserves. We explore how we can steward these forests to increase their resilience to climate change. It will be published at the end of this year. It will be presented in Washington, D.C. in March, and it's intended to inform federal policy. These were the instructions we were given. So the story here is, this is a patch of BLM land. It's right next to where the Archie Creek fire, which is one of the mega fires, burned. And this stand did not burn. And it's right next to where all those dying trees are, those Doug firs that are dying, that have brown tops, many of them at this point. This is an ancient cedar tree, and I'm in the purple jacket. I'm standing next to Jerry Franklin, who's one of my mentors, has been a longtime mentor of mine since I was a grad student. Ed Wheeler, the director of the ONC land, Oregon and California Railroad Forest Lands for BLM, is standing on the other side of me. There's some of the BLM silviculturists, and there is one of the tribal forest leaders, that, we're all together, and we get to this stand, we kind of bushwhack over there, and they all turn to me, and the Forest Service manager leader for that district, she turns to me and she said, "Okay, Cristina, how would you restore this?" Andrew Marshall is there. He's a fire ecologist who's finding lots of evidence of the cultural burning, even in these moist, especially in the moist forests. And Colin Beck, he's a Siti Klusi forest director. So they put me on the spot, and Jerry is standing next to me, right? And so I said, well, as an Indigenous woman, the first thing I would do, and a Western trained scientist, I have very formal scientific training. The first thing I do is I would talk to the elders, and I'd say, tell me a story about this forest. What did it look like? What did the ancestors do here? And then I would sit in that forest and listen to it, sit in there by myself and just pay attention without any preconceived ideas. And then based on what the elders shared, I would take a very thorough Western science ecological assessment of the understory and overstory characteristics of that stand, also soil conditions, soil biochemistry, and nutrients. And after I had the Western science data secured with my team, then what I would do is get the elders back out. And so that's a Doug fir, and those are all mostly dying. Sorry, that's a cedar, big old cedar tree, and those are mostly dying Doug firs. So how do you fix that? And they said, oh, and there's a spotted owl nest in that stand as well. Now remember the images of all those fires, right? So what I would do is I would very carefully thin it in a respectful, with the elders guiding me, with fire ecologists and forest Western scientists guiding as well, in the same way that you would, take care of your family. Then I would collect the seeds of all the native plants in the understory and keep them for ecocultural restoration purposes. Then I would burn it with a cultural burn. Then I would come back the next year and plant the seeds that we had collected. And then we would watch that forest and see how it developed. This is the way Native people tended forests for millennia, and they were much more open than they are today. We've gone from one extreme to another, and the answer lies somewhere in there, but what we're doing right now isn't working because of climate change and all those mega fires. Here is the executive summary, the beginning of it for our report. The problem is that North American forests are experiencing unprecedented challenges due to extreme wildfires, pathogen and insect outbreaks, heat stress, drought, rapid development, and invasive species. Exacerbated by climate change, these threats collectively diminish economic values, cultural values, and habitat. Particularly because of fire exclusion, contemporary and historical management policies are root causes of current forest conditions. So this is where we're at. We're braiding sweetgrass and trying to figure out the best path forward to save these forests, and especially to save mature and old growth forest. With that, I think there's time to have questions and conversation about this, and I encourage that. This is uncharted terrain that we're in right now. It's happening because of climate change to forests in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And we need each other, and we need to have conversations in order to figure this out. So I welcome any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you so much, Christina. There's a question in the Q&A. What is a cultural burn?
A cultural burn. So it's different than a prescribed burn. A prescribed burn is the Western science version. A cultural burn is you walk in the forest and you use a fire stick. That's how it was typically done. And you set these fires when the forest is going to be resistant to burning. So right after snow melt, right as spring is beginning is a good time. Sometimes in the fall after the first fall rains have come. And you set these very light fires, and you don't set them like in a grid following lines. You set them kind of in a mosaic or a patchwork style. And they're used to tend things like crops, like huckleberries, for example, depend on fire to thrive. So those cultural burns were usually almost always tied to very culturally significant understory species. And what those cultural burns also did was that they would remove some of the little saplings coming in that cause this dense, closed canopy where then trees start dying because there's not enough moisture to support all those trees growing so densely. So that's what a cultural burn does. It keeps a forest a bit more open and alive, and it improves habitat for culturally significant species of plants and animals.
And there's a related question. Do animals or other beings get killed or hurt from the burns?
No, no. In fact, I've been involved in a number of cultural burns, and deer and elk and grizzly bears and wolves, they're drawn to those burns because they know that they're light, and they kind of hang out on the periphery. And the minute the burn is over, things start sprouting right away. And the foods that sprout, like the grasses, like elk love cultural burns because the grasses are super rich in protein that come up after a fire, like, 5 times more protein than the grasses had before the fire. And so these animals know that. So these burns do not harm wildlife. It's the opposite. They greatly improve wildlife habitat. And these animals know that. So when Native people used to burn, the animals would follow them around, and they would like wait a day or two, and then they'd show up in the fire site. And they're so low severity that they don't get very hot. So it's safe for the animals to do that.
Thanks, audience. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. How are invasive species handled and best managed within your work, Cristina?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I'm actually working with the Grand Ronde on that. So the Grand Ronde are among the tribes. So our traditional ecological knowledge involves ethics, moral principles of doing no harm. And so most Native people do not want to use herbicides or lethal methods of controlling things. So one of the things that the Grand Ronde are doing is they're experimenting with goats, which are very selective grazers and browsers, and they're coming in. And because when you burn, there are certain invasive species in the Pacific Northwest that just go crazy, and they respond to the fire. They're ruderal. So they're those species that and they're all from Europe, these species that people brought in, what they were familiar with from home, and not realizing that this was a harmful thing to do. The settlers didn't understand that. And actually, we didn't really understand the damage of invasives until maybe in the last 20, 30 years. And so, yeah, so they're experimenting with things like oats. And there's a master student whose committee that I'm on who has a memorandum of understanding with the Grand Ronde, and I helped her with that. And so they're experimenting with non-lethal methods of control of invasive species because they want to burn the area, but they can't until they get some control over the invasive species of plants.
Got a couple more burn-related questions. The first one is, would you be able to share about whether or not cultural burning may have been practiced in freshwater wetlands or tidal wetlands in the Pacific Northwest?
Yes, it was. It was all the way up and down the coast, and in the wetlands it was seasonally at certain times. When cultural burning took place, depended. So I mentioned that part of Indigenous knowledge is this awareness that the world is always changing. And so the Western way of doing things, the agencies have these static management actions that they apply in a grid following straight lines at exactly this time. And the Native world view of the world is, well, you go there and you see, was this a drought year or not? If it was, maybe we can burn now instead of, 6 weeks later, or so that. But yes, cultural burning was part of wetland tending.
How can you tell which burns are cultural and which are low severity natural burns, like from lightning? Or were those kinds of burns taken advantage of and made cultural?
Well, the second part of this is another great question. The second part is, yes, they were taken advantage of, but how can you tell? Well, I mentioned Andrew Marshall, and one of the new graduate students on our project in Western Oregon is actually from the Warm Springs Band. He's an enrolled member, and he was their fire manager. So now he's getting his master's degree looking at cultural burning history. So 2 ways to look for cultural burning is by digging a soil pit, and you get layers of pyrogenic carbon, which are charcoal. And we dug a soil pit, Tom DeLuca and the field crew, that went down a meter, and there was pyrogenic carbon all the way down in what used to be a cedar forest, right next to massive cedar stumps. See, the kind of stumps that are enormous that used to exist here. So what happens is you can carbon date that, so you can tell the exact date that that carbon was deposited. The other thing is that Andrew Michel takes stumps, and he is able to take a cookie from a stump, that's like a slice of it, from like these old cedars, and he's able to reconstruct the fire history and by date by doing dendrochronology, so tree ring analysis. And then you do an analysis, and we have all these climate records. So we know what were the dry years, what were the wet years. We can also tell whether the burn occurred in the spring or later in the season. And then you run statistical analyses to see if there's any relationship between the weather patterns and when the burn occurred. And a lot of these burns occurred at a time which was not when there's normally lightning storms, not during drought years. Many of them occurred during very wet years, which fits what I've described to you, that people would wait till there was a certain amount of moisture in the system so that when they did set a fire, it would not get out of control. It would be very low in heat, and that low in severity and intensity. Intensity means heat. So that's part of what we're doing on our Oregon project, and others are doing also in the Pacific Northwest. James Johnston is a leader in this, is reconstructing that fire history and comparing it to weather and climate records.
For continuity, I'll read this question next. With the vast acreage of forest lands that have not been tended well, do you think it will be necessary to train non-native populations to enact burns, or would this not be appropriate?
It is appropriate, and that is what our Indigenous Natural Resource Office is about bringing people together across cultures. And this is what the state of Oregon is engaging me in, and the Forest Service and Dr. Frank Lake is working on is, there's so much work to be done. How do we do it together? We need each other. And the other thing is that what I just described to you, our report is about all of the United States. And what is happening in the Pacific Northwest is happening in other places. And I haven't even mentioned oak savanna and, these other, hardwood forests that are also old growth that are in trouble and encroached on by conifers that did not used to be there. So across what is the United States, there's a vast amount of ecocultural restoration work to do, and we all need each other to do it together.
Got a question about logging. So this person writes, I am a lifelong Oregon resident, and my view of native resource management is deeply impacted by seeing wholesale logging on the Warm Springs Reservation. How is this part of the native philosophies you described?
Well, native practices, in fact, I'll describe what I'm doing tomorrow. I'm leading a briefing for the White House on this, and I'm also giving a presentation to the Intertribal Timber Council on this. First thing in the morning, the Intertribal Timber Council, and a couple hours later, the White House. And the Intertribal Timber Council has been around for 70 years, and there's, I think, 54 tribes are members of it, maybe more than that. And so they've gone from being encouraged 50 years ago to follow conventional, Pinchovian methods of silviculture and harvest, to now wanting to use ecocultural approaches. And a great example are the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Indians. I've spent time with them on their timberlands that they just got from BLM. They were restored to them in 2018. And they're doing ecocultural restoration on them. So it's like what I described in that old growth forest. They are having elders share stories about what these lands used to look like, and then using a 7th generation approach. So if we want to have old growth 7 generations of humans into the future. That's about 140 years. We have to create that structure today. And so what they're doing is they're saving all the old trees. They're removing the toothpick trees very carefully, protecting riparian corridors, and planning for 7 generations in the future, and planting native species of trees and understory plants in the areas where they have removed, like the monoculture of Doug firs that were planted for harvest in that very Western style. It's messy at the beginning, but when you look at it through the Indigenous knowledge lens, you see there's this beautiful old growth forest that's eventually going to be there, right? But you have to restore to that.
This listener writes, I'm fascinated by the early chart you showed with ego versus eco. Moving forward, how much of a role would you say humans play in earth stewardship? I am always concerned on how much to control versus just watch and listen more, like you said in your cedar rehab.
I agree with you, and that's with stewardship. So one of the things in our report to the White House is it's not management, it's stewardship. And humans are embedded in nature, and nature, tending nature, is our moral responsibility. And so I think that it requires a paradigm shift, and that's how the White House is referring to it. This is a paradigm shift, and it's not everybody's going to agree with it, but it is a shift to our original relations with the natural world and the healing that can happen. Part of it is reciprocity, so you only take what you need. Economics and capitalism is about continuous growth. And as an ecologist, a Western ecologist, I can tell you that there's no such thing as continuous growth. Ecosystems have a carrying capacity, and there's only so much they can support. And so, to find what that is through the lens of both Western science and Indigenous knowledge, that is that paradigm. And to do that with care.
We've got a handful more questions. I think we can get through them all. These two are related. I'll give them both to you, Cristina. The first is, aside from grazing and burning, what are some other common practices for fuels reduction in the Pacific Northwest? And another person writes, here in Eastern Oregon, the preferred method of fire control is cutting undergrowth and thinning the forest. What do you think of this practice that tends to leave a very uniform plantation-like forest? So thoughts on forest management.
Those are related. So one of the key practices for reducing fuels is to do a cultural burn. And that's one of the reasons Native people burned, was to reduce the fire, the large fire risk. And so to reinstate cultural burning. However, as I described, this was done like not in straight lines with a fire crew walking in this grid. And here's this gridded off, section of land, which is, 80 acres or whatever it is you designate as your restoration site, and you walk it in a uniform way. Then you end up getting a uniform response. But it is a very non-linear, holistic approach to that. In terms of thinning that is done in the same way, when you have a stand like the shocking pictures I showed you of those trees dying, you can take out very selectively the trees that are going to die and are going to provide these ladder fuels that are going to explode into the canopy and then turn into a large, extensive fire, high severity fire. You can remove those, and there's ways to remove them that does not impair the other trees. But it's like looking at each each tree is an individual and making those decisions, not making a wholesale decision, not having a uniform like pre-commercial thinning, but really thinking through what are we restoring to? And we're restoring to structure and function. It's not about board feet. It's not about here's this unit and we're going to manage it this way. We don't manage, we steward. And it's not a unit, it is a living forest, right? And so how do we care for it in the best possible way?
I think we've got time for about 3 more. Do you know if cultural burning is practiced by Indigenous people living in the American tropics?
There is some of it, but not as much. And in portions of Central America, there's cultural burning, and in other portions there isn't. It's not as uniform. The temperate forests that we have in North America, cultural burning is used as a tool in probably 90% of them. When you start going more into the tropics, that proportion diminishes.
We've in 2 more voices. Where is the most funding needed now?
To fund building these relationships across cultures. And I received a grant with Tom DeLuca to create tribal roundtables, exploring the topic of co-stewardship. And so the funding is needed to support building these relationships. A really big piece of this is capacity within tribal nations. So I learned last year that I'm one of 3 Indigenous women who have PhDs in forestry in the United States. I was shocked, right? In my position as an associate dean, one of my roles is to support student success and to recruit Indigenous students and build scholarship funds for them. And so in the federal grants, all the federal grants that I have, I've put in, funding for STEM education as a requirement. So that's an area to build that capacity with tribal nations. I'll be very honest. Settler colonialism devastated Indigenous communities. They tried to eliminate tribes. And there's stuff in the federal record from the 1800s that very clearly expresses that they were trying to eliminate tribes. And guess what? It didn't work, right? But the Native people who are here and my dear colleagues who are members of Oregon's tribal nations, they're tenacious and brave and strong and hurting. And so there's a lot more healing that needs to happen. And that is the most direct way to do that is by working with tribal youth. And actually, I think that's a role that Sitka Center has played historically, and to maybe think about the role of working with tribal youth in that nexus of the arts and ecology. It could be really powerful, and this is a very special place to do some of that work.
That's inspiring feedback. I'll close us with this final question. What advice do you have for restoration ecologists trained in Western science who want to honor, learn, and incorporate Indigenous knowledge in their everyday work?
So it's proprietary Indigenous knowledge. It's like something that has a patent on it. So, and it's very place-based. So where you want to work in your everyday work, Native communities want to build allyships and want to have strong partners. So I suggest that you reach out to the Indigenous community, their natural resources department, their forestry department, and their culture department is super important. I should mention that the director, the assistant director for the Coos tribes, Confederated tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusa tribes of Indians, she's my master's student. And, I told her when we started working together, I can't teach you much. You're going to be teaching me way more than what, anything I'm going to learn. But it's that pairing of the two worlds, because I have all of that, training in Western science. And she has this deep, deep knowledge of these forests from a cultural perspective, and she's worried about them, and she and her community want to restore them. So, talk to those folks, and if you're an Oregonian, please reach out to me. My email address is on this slide, and I'm happy to help you make connections as needed.
Dr. Cristina Eisenberg, thank you so much for this thought-provoking and powerful and actionable talk. Just so grateful to you for sharing your Indigenous knowledge with the Sitka community. A lot of them showed up. We had an audience of well over 100 people participate this evening. So grateful to the Sitka community for taking part. Thanks to Nicola for turning our slides for us and everyone on the Sitka team behind the scenes. Just so grateful. Going to wish everyone a good night and season's greetings, and look forward to seeing you back for our next resident talk in the new year. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you all. Thank you for your questions. You
Thanks
have a
so
good
much.
night.
Good night, everyone.